Hello, and today's lesson is about biochemistry, which I like to call chemistry with a purpose. The objectives are to determine how chemistry is related to biology and learn the four major biological macromolecules and the function of each. It is basically to introduce you to this topic so that for the rest of the week we will be able to work with these molecules and figure out more about them. So to start off with, a major important aspect of chemistry in biology is energy and reactions because every part of you is reacting with something right now. And how you are actually living, breathing, functioning are through these reactions in your body. And you have what's known as endothermic versus exothermic reactions. If you remember, these terms from chemistry have to do with whether the energy in the reactants is greater or less than the energy of the products. And that determines whether it is an endothermic versus an exothermic reaction. Activation energy works and plays in with all of this is the fact that there is a certain amount of energy that is needed for a reaction to occur. And this is your activation energy. And if you look at the graph below, you can see that there's activation energy. So you need to add energy for a reaction to occur. And if you look at the two different lines, one of them is the activation energy without the enzyme, and that's a higher one. And the lower one is the activation energy with an enzyme. So in general, an enzyme is something that is new to you, but it is a thing that lowers the activation energy of a reaction. And we're going to get more into this when we discuss the macromolecules because that is what an enzyme is. But you have enzymes everywhere in your body that make reactions go or not. So getting into the biological macromolecules, you have carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. You've probably heard about most of these in health class, and we are going to look at the biology aspect of them, not necessarily the nutritional aspect of them. So take what you learned in health, and you're going to be able to apply it a little here, but we're going to tweak it and work with it. So the first macromolecule is a carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are composed of carbon, hydrogens, and oxygens. Carbohydrates are always in a 2-to-1 hydrogen to oxygen ratio. So for instance, glucose is a carbohydrate that is the chemical formula C6H12O6. So notice the 12 hydrogens to the 6 oxygens making the 2-to-1 ratio. There are also some carbohydrates that have a phosphate group attached, and that gives it a little extra energy, and these are known as sugar phosphates. Now there are specific types of carbohydrates. These are your monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. The top picture is a monosaccharide, and a monosaccharide is a building block of carbohydrate. Glucose is an example. Note the C6H12O6 is the most basic unit that can still be considered a carbohydrate. A disaccharide is when you put two monosaccharides together, like in the picture below. You'll see that they have linked and bonded two monosaccharides together. And this picture shows sucrose, which is your table sugar. And then a polysaccharide is 3 or more monosaccharides added together. So if you added another glucose onto that sucrose, then you would end up with a polysaccharide. Now in nutritional sense, monosaccharides are the things that are able to be absorbed directly into your bloodstream. So your glucose tablets that a lot of people take when they're running long distances, those are able to be absorbed directly into their bloodstream, which is a bonus because they do not have to digest them. Polysaccharides are your complex carbohydrates, so your grains, your pasta, that you have to break down and it takes a little while. So that's why you do not want to necessarily eat pasta as you're exercising because you won't get the actual functionality of it. You actually have to digest it first. The second type of macromolecule is a lipid, which the fatty acid is a building block. Lipids do not dissolve in water due to their hydrophobic and hydrophilic ends. So if you look at the picture, those are pictures of fatty acids, and you have your carboxyl group on one end and a hydrocarbon on the other. You notice it's just a long, long chain of carbons. Each one of those lines represents a bond between two carbons. So your fatty acids are just a long chain of carbons, and you can have what's known as saturated versus unsaturated fatty acids. And this picture depicts both of them. On the left, you have a saturated fatty acid, and on the right you have an unsaturated, because if you note there is a double bond between two of the carbons on the one on the right, and that makes it an unsaturated, meaning that it doesn't have the maximum number of hydrogens that are attached to the carbons, hence the double bond. Whereas in the saturated, you have the maximum number of hydrogens attached to your carbons. Now, lipids, as I said, have functions in your body, therefore long-term energy store, and they store your carbon, that you can break down lipids and get carbon and get energy. So when you're running or exercising, you break down your carbohydrates for your quick energy at first, and then if you run long enough, or if you haven't eaten for a while, you start breaking down those lipids, and that energy is useful to you. They're also a building part of your cell membrane. They are very, very important in creating your cell membranes because your cells do not want to dissolve in water, and having a lipid cell membrane allows your cells to not dissolve in water. And there are actually two major examples of lipids, the phospholipids and steroids. Phospholipids are ones that you probably haven't heard of. They're the ones that are found in your cell membrane. So on the top picture is actually a picture of your cell membrane, and notice that there are two layers of phospholipids. So your cell membrane is what's known as a phospholipid bilayer. The next example are steroids, which a lot of people have heard about, and the picture below shows you 4 different steroids: your testosterone, your cortisone, your vitamin D, and your cholesterol. The next macromolecule is a protein, and the building block of a protein is an amino acid, and there are actually 20 total amino acids. So with carbohydrates, you have your monosaccharide, and you could have a whole bunch of monosaccharides. With your lipids, your fatty acids, you either have saturated or unsaturated, and they can have a number of different lengths of carbons. But with amino acids, there's a set number, and that number is 20. Because the amino acid structure, you have a central carbon, as shown in the picture, bonded to a single hydrogen, which is the one up in the middle, and then the carboxyl group on the right and the amine group on the left. And then the fourth bond is the side chain or functional group, and that's where each amino acid is different. So that side chain could be a whole number of things. It could just be a hydrogen, it could be another carboxyl group, it could be an OH, and that's why you have 20 total amino acids. Each of those 20 has a unique side chain. Now, if you put a few amino acids together, more specifically, if you get 2 amino acids together, you get what's known as a dipeptide, similar to the disaccharide, and then 3 or more are polypeptides. And this is because the amino acids are connected by a type of covalent bond known as a peptide bond, hence the name dipeptide and polypeptide. Now, if you see in the picture, that is an amino acid chain, and each one of those is a different amino acid, and the order of amino acids determines what protein you made. So this one is the protein insulin, and then another, if I switched out one of these amino acids and put in another one, you get a completely different protein, because proteins heavily rely on their shape. The order of amino acids generally determines the shape of the protein. A more specific type of protein is an enzyme, if you remember back to the beginning, dealing with the energy. And what enzymes do is they act as catalysts on the substrate, lowering the activation energy. And they actually depend hugely on their shape. It's what's known as a lock and key method. Think of a lock, and you need a specific shaped key in order to open that lock. Same thing with enzymes. You need a specific shaped enzyme to fit on your reactants or substrate to make the reaction go. So they completely depend on the shape, and if they don't fit on, then they won't work. So that's where temperature and pH can actually change the shape of your protein and therefore make them inactive. So within your body, you generally have a neutral pH. So most enzymes are good at working at a neutral pH and your body temperature. But what happens if you make something too acidic? Your enzyme won't work, and that's why maintaining homeostasis in your body is super important. The last macromolecule is known as a nucleic acid. Nucleic acids are very large and complex, and we are actually doing a few units later in the year on them. The DNA and RNA are examples of nucleic acids: deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. You may have heard of them because it is your hereditary information for every person and every organism. They are very complex. But in basic terms, we have our nucleotides, which is the building block of a nucleic acid, and each nucleotide is made up of a phosphate group, a sugar, and a nitrogen base. The sugar differs between the DNA and RNA. You have ribose for RNA and deoxyribose for DNA. And then the nitrogen base, there are actually a few different nitrogen bases, and that is what makes each nucleotide slightly different. You have adenine, guanine, cytosine, thymine, and uracil. So you have 5 total, and when we get into the unit on DNA, we'll look at these more closely and why we have 5. Nitrogen-based sequence within your DNA actually determines the sequence of an amino acid of a protein, and that's how the DNA actually regulates what's going on in your body. They determine what proteins are being made. So this is the basics of biochemistry, and we're going to work with these a little more, look into them a little further, and look at their actual chemical formulas, which is difficult to do in a video. So we're going to be working with them for a few days so it makes sure that you understand everything fully. But I hope this gave you a general overview of your biochemistry.